is, as I said, our summary class, and its conclusion about social problem solving in general, and about part 2. And as I said, for comparison, since what Tarde had suggested that we really don't know each other, that we spend our lives in imitations or inventions. Simmel argued we need social frameworks to communicate, to problem solve, but we don't really have a chance to describe ourselves. As I said last time, I spent most of the class describing other people's ideas, and I think a good comparison would be to my own, because I'm aware of all these different thinkers and have added a lot of different things. And my problem solving has been, how do you make durable democracies, particularly looking at long-term historical patterns, as well as the interest in environmental improvement, or sustainability and unsustainability. And I argue that we see both in the past and the present, instead of this just being an era of degradation and the past just being totally different. It's a lot of similarities I see with the past, but social problem solving in the big 6. Anyone remember what MDW set meant? What did that stand for?
Marx, Durkheim, Whitaker, Simmel, Elias,
Tarde. That's right. Everybody got, I heard it, MDW is the big 3 as they're called. That's Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, and most sociologists will know that. But the wider set is SET, Simmel, Elias, and Tarde. And those are the images that I showed you earlier about that. So, MDW sets you on the right path in understanding social problem solving. The point of part 2 was to give you this basic vocabulary of understanding how people have tried to create solutions. But as I described that, people don't just create solutions. They have to create a problem. They create a problem first. For Marx, it was the problem of industrial inequality. For Simmel, the problem was, how do you have an individual fulfilled life? I mean, they have very different questions and very different things they're trying to solve. But all of them, I told you, are 6 different eyes we can use, and we try to put them together instead of trying to convince you of one or the other. You may believe in one more than the other, and that's fine. But I want to try to show you how I synthesize a lot of all 6. And of course, as I said, and we already know, that's MVW SET was Karl Marx, Durkheim, Max Weber, George Simmel, Elias, and Tarde. Tarde, of course, coming in second in age to Karl Marx, but really he is last because he introduces our next problem-solving set of social environmental problem solving. How have people tried to understand environmental damage and improvement, and how have they tried to fix it? And so, as I said, we can also have another abbreviation throughout part 2 that you can take with you for the rest of your lives, OEMF. So what does that stand for? What does that abbreviation stand for?
Ontology, epistemology, method, and fix.
Right, methods and fix, right. And you may say, well, these are all sort of blended together. That's true, because you can't really have an ontology without your own understanding of what data justifies that. So they're really linked together. And I have a small chart to show you how they link together in a minute. As you said, ontology, epistemology, methods, and fixes. And the fixes comes from Heberlein, who is an environmental sociologist and still alive and kicking. But in the 1970s, he wrote an article. We read that article, and what were his ideas about fixes? What were the 3 kinds of fixes that he had?
Structural fix, cognitive fix, and environmental
And
fix.
where we are, what's the name of the department? Technological fix. It's right at the tip of our noses. And that's what your papers are about, because we have not addressed technological fix, because for Heberlein, the cognitive fix, you directly interface with people. You have to convince them of some change, but that's sometimes difficult. So people invented technological fixes which avoid that human element. That's the way he described it. You have cognitive fixes, but when people don't listen to you, you may just try a technological fix. And people keep destroying the, on Songdo, for instance, for a long time, there's no garbage cans in the public spaces. That is a technological fix, just try to stop people from doing things. But increasingly, they've added them because people put garbage in places anyway. Another technological fix, you change the infrastructure around that. But, structural fixes are sort of in the middle of larger infrastructures and law. You change the law. If you had a garbage problem, instead of just trying to remove or add garbage cans, you would make the fines very large. That's the idea of a structural fix. But most social problem solvers have concentrated on which two areas, if you think about the 6 people? It's a new question. Do you see a lot of them talking about cognitive fixes? They're trying to explain a new view. Yeah, so I would say they're cognitive fixers. A lot of them have structural fix, like they want to change something about all of society or the rules or the organization of industry. But there's very few that talk about technological fixes, like, well, sometimes we can just change the material and that'll solve problems, or sometimes we just change the technology and that'll solve a problem. I'm going to classify myself as doing all 3 right now. So I'm kind of one of the few, I guess, sociologists who would have a technological fixed view of some things. And that's sort of why I'm here. It fits very well, I think, in a department of technology and society. Anyway, here's the graph I was showing you, and I've tried to draw this with very bad magic markers occasionally. But ontology, epistemology, and methods. And the fixes are in the middle. As you can see, if you have a particular view of the world, it's always surrounded by the way you gather data and the way you justify data. So the fixes are sort of in the middle, but think about it this way. The fixes are also protected. They're protected by this bubble. Like for Karl Marx, if you don't believe in material, here's the ontology. If you don't believe in material dialectics and material driving society, then you're not going to gather data about material issues, and you're not going to be interested in historical methods. So the fixes you come to are really determined by the choices you make and the ontologies you have. So as I said earlier, sort of against Marx here, I'm saying that our ideas really do matter. Our ideas matter of how we think about the world, because if we think differently, we may solve the same problem very differently. And you'll come across your life, I think, people who will think very differently than you about one problem, or the way you define a problem, or the way you bring data into a problem. But I made that graph to make it easier to think about. So here's the summary of 6 different portraits. Summary of our social problem solving. First, let's look at the summary of OEMF. What is social anyway? That's a question of ontology. And how does that influence data, epistemology, methods chosen, and fixes desired? And there's, of course, Karl Marx. Ontology, he's known for historical dialectics, more only in conflicts. And obviously, workers and capitalists are cooperating somewhat. And the city is not just a site of total conflict, otherwise it would fall apart immediately. But for Marx, you only sample the data about conflict. Why? Because that's your ontology. And if you're interested in conflicts in history, you have to sample widely in history. Some social thinkers don't have a very deep view of history, particularly a lot of modern social thinkers. Man, anyone recognize that beady-eyed old man there with the bald head? Who's that? Who is that? Nobody? Oh, I'm ashamed. That's Emil Durkheim. It's MDWSET. So for the future, now you can know who I'm going to introduce. So that's MD Durkheim. And for Durkheim ontology, collective actions pushing on people. And I told you Durkheim had sort of a blind spot about an individual. There's no individuals at all. He doesn't sample that data. He doesn't even care about it. He just assumes it's not important. And so all of his views, if you believe that collective things are the only thing real, what are you going to look at in history? What are you going to sample or think about? Just many things. Crowd activities, religion, rituals, institutions, the way people come together, the symbols they use, flags and things, collective things in general, and how people develop a collective attitude. He's generally idealist. Ideas are more important than anything. Ideas bring us together. We read one small essay where Durkheim was critical of someone who was of the Marxist perspective, and he says, well, as we now know, ideas sort of formulate the basic principles of societies, like early religion. And then from those religious cultural frameworks, we develop an economy. So he tried to argue that ideas were before or more important than material things. And just like, I showed you here, if you believe that, you're only going to look at data that relates to that perspective. And all of your fixes are going to be about changing social things, not changing material things. And that's Durkheim. So MDW, who's W? Weber, yeah. And there's a younger, more handsome Weber, not the crazed guy who looked haunted earlier. Anyway, Max Weber died in 1920, but totally opposite of Durkheim. If Durkheim had a blind spot for social things, for individual things, Max Weber really thought everything was individual. He didn't have a justification for thinking that capitalism was a thing. It's sort of if you believe it exists, that will motivate you individually to do things. If you are a Marxist, that will motivate you individually to do and act a certain way. If you believe you are Durkheim, that will motivate you to individually act and do in a certain way. So, as I said, I'm subsoc act is the abbreviation for him. That's individually motivated subjective social action. Totally opposite to Durkheim. But instead of only individuals, he builds from it. As I just showed you that pyramid, we started with 4 different ideal types of individual actions. And then he said, well, individuals build different kinds of hierarchies. Some are based upon charisma between an individual strong leader and everybody who loves that leader. It could be a pop star, it could be a political candidate. But then he says there's other kinds of hierarchies that are more rule-based, where the individual is not very important, but the individual is still there. They're just bound by a lot of different rules. That's a bureaucracy. And also there's hereditary leadership. You can see those are 3 kinds of ways individuals come together and make larger structures. And then it went on with that. But mostly he's also critiquing Marx, mostly idealist. His famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, tried to argue that religious ideas came first and motivated people to be more greedy and interested in material things. That's been critiqued, and I totally believe in that critique, actually. But it's important to know, as I showed you, if you believe that, you're only going to think in that way. So if you believe that ideas are more important, you're not going to write a story where materials are important. But anyway, who's that? Simmel, yes. And Simmel, forms and contents. Just like software, hardware. We are the hardware, and the software is what is in our heads, the way we act, and the way we interact. He says he's very interested in individuals, so he's very much an individualist, but he says we as individuals can't be individuals. We need some social thing to be, to make us whole, to make us functional. And there's 2 kinds. One is this timeless view of social forms, and that's, the stranger in society, what money does to a society. He tried to argue these are timeless arrangements of social relationships. The role of the city on individual mental capacity. We talked about that, the metropolis and mental life. I also talked about the way he thought about the aristocracy, this social form of the aristocracy trapped between the royal house and the peasants. So it develops a very different life. It can't be different from the others. But also, most people don't really translate this, but in addition to his more timeless views that are positivist, general knowledge, he believes in more historical cultural forms, like the rise of K-pop, for instance. How did that develop? Once it's developed, then that's a new social form that people can become. You need social forms and cultural forms to be human, he's basically arguing. So he's both positivist and historical in an interesting balance. So MDWSE, who's that? Yeah, Elias. Elias is correct, but I like to say Elias. He noticed how long he lived. And just very appropriately, he's interested in long-term patterns, right? His word to remember is figurations. I wrote and gave you an abbreviation, Hi-Fi UID. Anybody remember what that stood for? Those 4 letters. Yeah, historical, individuals, plural, yeah. Configurations, interacting, intertwining configurations. And the strong point for Elias is unplanned interactions, UI. Elias doesn't really care to sample data about planned activities. That's exactly what Weber would do. Weber's all about people's motivations or their habits. They want to do things emotionally. They want to do things rationally. But for Elias, it's like, that's not social. What's social is to be explained these long-term things that no individual created. A state was not created by some individual thinking about it, but it's a long-term process. Why is everybody in Korean Confucian? It's not that somebody decided that to happen. It developed over time. Another example I gave was metal chopsticks in Korea, which is very different than Japanese wooden chopsticks or Chinese longer wooden chopsticks. So there's even cultural things like that develop according to Elias in two ways. There's two ways that Elias tried to think of a pattern of how these long-term patterns happen. One was the state. The state culture is something that people want to join or copy. So they do what people in elite positions do. I gave you the example of the French potato. The French peasants wouldn't eat the potato. The King of France says, let's plant it in my garden and not put guards on it, and everybody will think it's really good, and therefore everybody will copy potato use. And France does eat a lot of potatoes now, so it totally works. In many places in his book, he describes how patterns of behavior, of dance, of speech, of etiquette. It's etiquette, like how you treat people. The Japanese will have a slightly different way of exchanging cards with each other than Koreans do. I mean, no one person invented that. It's this interactive quality that is inherited over time and adapted. So his positivist. Positivist means he thinks these are neutral knowledge things. Two things. One thing I said, states, but the other thing is this, external to internal. Once, 300, 400 years ago, people had to read books, for instance, about Confucianism. And then later, no one needs books. That's what he means. It's like, a long time ago, Christianity had to be brought about through manuscripts and secret meetings. And then later, nobody really needs that. You can actually just, it's just in the air in many societies. Same with Buddhism, same with long-term religious changes in general. These are sort of unplanned interactions. There may be plans, but they don't predict the whole flow of history. And how etiquette comes from books originally, according to Elias, and then later people don't need the books. They're just naturally, emotionally ashamed of their behavior. I gave the example of how in Europe people used to eat and throw food and drop things and spit and have no problem with that. It's not embarrassing. But later, it's embarrassing and it's internal. So he's interested about that. The things he wants to fix is, he's obviously, if you have that belief, you're not going to try to make any quick changes because you don't think they'll ever be important enough. It's these long-term interactions. So he is very patient, I guess, about change. And then the last person is who? Yeah, Gabriel Tarde. We just discussed him recently. Imitation and invention. And unlike everybody else, everything is social. My interaction with people, my individual feelings, my interaction with this desk, my interaction with the environment. So for Tarde, there's no true boundary. Everything is social. There's no borders either. Everything is porous and changing. Maybe something very famous in France will go over the border very easily and be popular in Germany. And something gets on the internet. As I said, Tarde really grew up too early and didn't have at his disposal the kind of epistemology and data that we all now take for granted. We open the newspaper or a website and we read about a survey about people's feelings and how they change over time about the economy. That's what Tarde is so interested in. These trends over time of rise and fall and support for things. He called it glory. The rise and fall of glory. And he says money is really just another example of support for glory. Like instead of thinking of money as material and objective, he saw money as a subjective issue. And you measure people's attitudes by measuring the scale of wealth around the society. So he has a very different view, and he introduces very well the next section. The next section is a more environmental section because Tarde is really an early environmental sociologist who did not develop much following until really 1980s and 90s when he was revived by French sociologists who are interested in science and technology. And Tarde's very interested in inventions, how new inventions are created too, and diffusion of inventions. So here's the 6. In this corner we have Marx, Durkheim, Weber, Elias, Simmel, Elias, and Tarde. And in this corner we have Whitaker, the reigning champ. No, and I will describe myself as slightly different. Just if you want to remember something about me, my ontology, I got interested in long-term patterns like Elias, and I sort of fell in love with Elias, but then fell out of love with Elias, but kept some things, kept positive memories of my love affair with Elias, I guess. But because I saw Elias had a huge hole, and the hole was individuals as individuals. And so I want to bring long-term patterns, but with more individual views. And so I think strategy and tactics, that would be 3 words, strategies and tactics. You can unpack everything that I think is real based upon that, at least what I find useful. And from strategies and tactics, I'm interested in jurisdictions. Jurisdictions are, leaderships and followers who think they're legitimate hierarchies. And that's like Weber too, right? It's sort of like Weber's interested in how do you make legitimate hierarchies, how do you make more durable development? But they're plural jurisdictions. All these other people are thinking about individual things. Weber talked about, the individual charisma, talked about a bureaucracy, talked about a religious hierarchy. But in the real world, there's a competition between religious hierarchies, between bureaucracies, and between charisma at the same time, in the same case. So you need to think in plural of how strategies and tactics were appealing to people and removing people from your group. The other word is accommodation. Accommodation is sort of a mix of conflict and cooperation. We are all accommodating here. I'm not telling you, but I don't like this room. But I'm not going to leave. I'm accommodating. Maybe you have something else to do. Maybe you're sick. You're accommodating by coming here. So some of you are totally interested, and you're coming here. So accommodation can be full of many different reasons for the same actions. And that's very different than Weber. Weber would say, if you're doing something different, you have a different action. But in my view, a lot of people can come together and have very different reasons why they're doing it. And that means we're still very private individuals, even in public. We all come and go in groups based on what we interpret is happening. And some people are total believers, some people are skeptical, some people are waiting for me to say something they don't like and they'll leave. So everybody is constantly accommodating, and it's conditional. We're not here under permanent conditions. If I start to do something absolutely crazy, the conditions change and people may run away. But if I start to talk about something interesting, new people will join. That's the point. And that's how politics works. You appeal with symbols and words, and you try to build a crowd, and you try to reduce the crowd in another group. You try to compete. So those are the issues there. I am both positivist and historical. I think there's some neutral knowledge we can take about jurisdictions in general. But historical, just like civil, both, because these are historically changing things. So I don't really follow a lot of these dichotomies. Dichotomies means an artificial separation. Like Durkheim had an artificial separation between individuals and social. Marx, artificial separation between individuals and social. I mean, it's very important for them to start on one side and versus the other. I don't care. I mean, they're both phenomenon, and I think they have to be integrated into one perspective. Elias almost did it, but he still comes down on one side. He still thinks everything is totally social, individuals are not important. But if we all come together in accommodations, that's one way of thinking about these interactions that are conditional. Like you come and join this until you don't like it and then you may leave. It's a conditional thing where the social group exists, but you still exist as an individual in the social group. I also don't think there's a predictable future. I think it's totally open. I follow that from the historical past. A lot of unpredictable, crazy things happened in the past that nobody suspected or wanted. Sometimes people plan, but sometimes unplanned interactions happen and mess things up. That's what Elias would be talking about. So we need to integrate planned and unplanned behavior. Not like the dichotomy of Elias where everything is unplanned and there's no plans. They need to have an appreciation of both. And just like Tarde, I'm very fascinated by, everything is social. This individual thing, our collective changes, and the environment and our interactions. So I draw a bit from everyone and critique a bit of everyone too. So just like for everyone else, the OEMF perspective, I'll do OEMF for me, Mark Whitaker. Ontology, I've got about 15 points to go through. Strategies and tactics. Since we're in a new room, I apologize. Typically, I was thinking of a larger slide projector. But I will speak to what's important, and I'll put this on the cloud drive for you to look at your leisure. So it starts with an individual issue, but no single individuals are important. I mean, they're important, but they're not totally important. Just, Weber, for individual, you couldn't talk about Weber unless you thought they were the most important thing. I don't think there is a most important thing. I think there's a lot of things that are equally important. So I'm trying to get away from trying to build thinking on one starting point. You need to think about the interactions of plural things all the time. And everybody is involved with strategies and tactics. And how I'm defining strategies, think of things that are inside of you, cognitive, like my interpretation of the class interaction with me. If I don't like the interpretation that I have, I may try to change my actions to change your strategies in the class. So different classifiable kinds of interpretive cognitive actions to others' actions. So I'm interested in these interactions of people. Like we always are talking to somebody and we're evaluating what they're doing. We're evaluating what the other person is doing and whether they're interested or not, and we may change our strategies based on the feedback we get in our interpretations of it. But you probably all met somebody who has no idea about that. So they don't care, they just, they keep talking as if their own personal strategies are most important and others' reactions are not important. So there's lots of variations here we can think about. I'll skip that. As I said, we can think about 4 kinds of these actions. I'm going to start with individuals, but I'm not Weber. I'm going to lead to a very different place. This is all about how things come together in accommodations. Some people, like Elias talked about, they internalize something. Their confusion emotionally. It's not just their acting, but they're emotionally going to blush. They're going to be terribly happy when other people are happy. They will be glad to aid people in a lower hierarchy. They will have a morality that's not just surface, but they'll feel it. They're religious believers like that. Some political party members, but not all political party members. So this is very different than Elias. Elias argued everybody naturally will become more internalized. No. Sometimes the conditions will change, and people who were internalized, like, I don't like this anymore. They're like, this is getting weird, I don't want to do this anymore. So I don't want to be this particular nationality anymore. I don't like this new kind of political attitude in the party. I joined the party when it was believing in these things and talking about these things, but the party has changed and I haven't changed, so I want to leave the party. You can explain things like that very easy. The internalization or lack of internalization. You can read the fine print later. But ambivalence. Some people are in groups because they're ambivalent. They're materially happy, but it doesn't matter to them whether they're really supporting this country or party. They join the party because of strategic reasons, like, well, maybe I joined this party to move up into the party and control it for my own personal business reasons. I want to associate myself with this party for other reasons. They don't really care ideologically what the party is for. Ambivalence means you're sort of materially happy, you may be ideationally opposed, yet you stay in the same situation, and you do nothing to change it. A lot of us are probably in ambivalent relationships. There's some things about an arrangement we don't like, but there's food, there's friends and company, I've done it before, I know how to act, so I stay there, even though I'm uncomfortable. That's ambivalence. Ambivalence means you have 2 views about the same thing. It literally means mixed feelings. It's like an uncertainty, your inability to make a choice. Here's a good example of how ambivalence you can see daily in the way groups interact. Think of a workers' strike in a factory, and the workers have this platform. The workers say, what we want to do, we want more pay, and we want to have more participation in exactly what management does. We want a more democratization of this business. We want it more like a co-op, cooperative, because we want more, we don't like the way people are treating us. And so, you know, the business owner smokes his cigar, says, okay, all right, I'll pay you more, but we're not democratizing this factory. This is a new condition, and the new group will change. Some groups will say, okay, that's enough, right? You know, like, okay, damn it, you know, it's too bad, but, you know, not get everything I want, but I'll stay. It's really materially good now. I got a better pay, we have the longer coffee breaks, and we have more smoke breaks. And so the material things may change in the agreement, but the structure of the way people interact may still be hierarchical and rude. And that's what ambivalence feels like. You know, you don't get everything you want, but you get some things, and you never really totally design what you want. Some people in this situation, here's another example, the workers in the factory again. Workers say, what we want is greater pay, and we want more democratization in our organization with you. We know you own it, but we're good workers, we've been here a long time, we'd like, you know, to continue this in our life. And then the owner says, oh really? You'd like to stay here? Well, screw you, stay here anyway. I'll let you keep your jobs, we're not changing anything. Nothing will ever change. This is quiescence. Quiescence means you have no faith that things will happen. You don't see an alternative. The owner may say, if you don't like it, you can leave, or I'll fire you if you keep complaining. So quiescence, you're not materially sated, you didn't get a raise, you're ideationally opposed, you don't like this thing, but you interpret your situation as trapped, without an option to change. Hopeless, despair, no future, so no action to change. Think about minorities in different countries under a racist system. Of course they don't like it. Of course they're poor. How do they change it? This is the situation that many people face, is quiescence. Like, they're afraid to organize because people have been killed in the past. I mean, this is the real world. So people are quiescent. Look, it's a very good word, quiescent. So I'm saying that that's one way of thinking about social activities. Then obviously revolt, back into the workers and the factory owners again, to use a Marxist analogy. The workers again say, what we want is to have greater material pay, and we want more democratization of this factory. And the owner says, no, I don't think that's really good. But then some of the workers say, look, let's just take over this factory and kill this guy and run it. So if that idea is popularized, they have a new future to create, and they may do it. Things like this have happened particularly in European history. There's lots of violence in European labor history where workers will take over the factory and for several months run it while the owners are tied up or under arrest inside the factory. And all they want to do is, they redesign a new future. They put a new framework for their lives. So people in revolt typically are not materially happy. They're ideationally opposed to something, yet they feel they're optimistic. They can change it. And they feel that a different future is possible. So they do it. And guess what? When you do it, it happens. That's the secret of life. If you do it, it happens. The opposite, you've probably seen this kind of behavior, is berserk. You know what berserk means? That's when you want to do something, you're not materially happy, you hate the political structure, you don't have a way to get out, but you want to act and you just destroy things. You don't have, that's berserk. You're exactly the same as revolt, yet you act to destroy without creating another future. There's a lot of history of people who faced with jurisdictions in history and they just burn it down, but they don't have any plans. They're just so mad, they don't want to be part of this structure anymore. So all those are different ways of thinking about how people come and go, literally, within social arrangements. The general point, getting too small, so I'll say it, people are unpredictable. without pattern of predictability, and how people move in history from one of these categories to the other. For instance, Elias would say everybody moves toward internalization. They all take things outside of them, and over time, unstoppably, they become, emotionally attached to things that they're around. I'm saying sometimes, people might start with internalization and go down. Like, I really like this situation. As you learn more about it, like, oh, this isn't really good for everybody. Nothing changes for you materially, but your interpretation changes. So you're more ambivalent. You say, well, I don't really like it, but at least I have my job and material things. Some people move from revolt in the opposite direction. Think of somebody who's going berserk. Berserk means, you just have no future, no hope. Maybe you get inspired by other people you meet in going berserk, and you go, oh, I'll join this other group. So you can join other groups with a positive view of revolt. But then people in revolt are always facing other groups, and those other groups, just like the capitalist businessman, they may say, look, I got a deal for you. I will give you land, I will give you settlements, but you have to stop your revolt. If you don't, I'll kill you. And so, some people refuse and they want to keep fighting. Other people may accept ambivalence. Like, they're not happy, they don't get what they want, but they get materially what they want, somewhat. And then maybe some people ambivalence over time do become internalized to it too. They forget their revolutionary background and they become, good bourgeois, I guess you could say. So people move up and down randomly too. Maybe just a rich person can come across a book by Karl Marx and it might change their entire view of the world. Or a revolutionary Marxist might pick up a book by Simmel and change their entire view of the world, and they totally lose capacity to be who they were. Tactics, if strategies are everything inside and cognitive, the way you think, tactics are what's around you. I only have this room to work with. I only have particular languages I speak. I only have access to a certain level of knowledge. I only have access to kind of materials. I can't travel around the world like I want. I'm certain locations. I have to act like a typical male. I have to at least be presentable as a male. There's certain things that I do tactically, and those are social forms that I have to do. I have to act in a certain way to appeal to a certain group of people. So tactics are what you do socially. It's like a list of buffet. Like, if you think of yourself as a clear glass person, it's like, what do you add to yourself from outside that allows other people to see you and to notice you? So tactics, everything inside, strategies, or tactics on the outside. Strategies on the inside. So I'm saying we have individuals, individuals in conditionally accommodated frameworks. This is both Weber as well as sort of Elias, depending on these ongoing external arrangements of alliances, of those three things, these new infrastructures. People need an infrastructure. Just like Simmel said, people need to have a social forum. I'm saying people need to be connected to some larger infrastructure in their life. They join this particular school, and they may not like everything about it, but there's certain things they like about it. If they really didn't like it, they might leave. Or they might revolt and try to change the structures of relationships. So those things can apply to any institution. I'll skip that point. So those 3 points are really a jurisdictional alliance. I'm suggesting we're all in an alliance. As a leader and followers, it's what we do together as leaders and followers. And sometimes leaders will push followers to do things, sometimes followers will push leaders to do things. But there's this third point between us. We have to share something between us to have anything to share. And that provides these micro foundations to a larger view. So just like Weber, who tried to build it from individuals, I'm trying to build it from these aggregates. The aggregates are the collected pieces of history, these jurisdictional alliances, or jurisdictions. But most people think of jurisdictions very differently than I'm suggesting. Most people think jurisdictions are politics, right? Politics, jurisdiction, power over somebody else. A market's very different. A religious structure is very different. I'm suggesting we have 4 different kinds of political institutions. States are one of them. The sciences and religion are others. Markets and consumption is another political institution. Finance is another political. I'm saying all these, you can see leaders and followers. You can see conditional relationships. And they're all organized the same. That's sort of a graph picturing this. if you have four positions of this kind of constitute, people are competing over how to design those relationships. There's, in the state, you have citizens as well as political elites. In science, you might have the previous generation of scientists and the new generation of students. And there may be a debate about what should be taught. There may be a debate about who gets to publish what. There's always a debate politically of who and what ideas and the way it goes. In markets and consumption, the political actors here are large corporations and consumers, or small suppliers and smaller consumers. So these are agreements that people have with each other. In finance, how many of us have a bank account? Right? We all have bank accounts. That's kind of a conditional arrangement. Tomorrow, if the bank sends you a letter and they say, look, we're just going to take your money. We don't really care anymore about the contract. That will lead you to revolt. Or you'll definitely call the bank and be really mad. So the bank has changed the terms of this agreement between leaders and followers. And you want to say, look, I don't like it, I'm going to leave. So if more people leave that relationship, the bank may get nervous and say, oh, okay, we'll give you a better deal, come back. That's how politics works in every institution. If enough people stop buying Samsung products, Samsung will say, okay, we'll do what you want, just tell us what you... So there's power in the consumers, there's power in the suppliers, but they all sort of conditionally have an accommodation with each other. Anyway, leaderships and followers are equally attempted to align with each other like this. And I think we can think about behavior in 17 ways and materials 94 ways, for those people who've seen my other class. But we'll talk about that another way. The point is the same with suppliers, same with religious leaders, same with bank owners and money users and their clients. It's all kind of a clientelistic relationship. Some very representative, some not representative. So I'm suggesting instead of just the state being political, all these other things are political. And the state doesn't have to be on top. Everything is on top. Everything is equally important. I'm not suggesting the state's that important. Sometimes, a lot of power is in major corporations, not just the state. The top four are chaebol in Korea, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and SK. They're about 50% of the whole state's economy. That's a huge amount of power. The state's not going to do anything without an alliance with those groups. Anyway, so I'm suggesting all four venues are the same, and they all have politics over the accommodations they have. And they all try to manipulate and maintain that group together. Why? Because these two types of leadership and follower positions, they're not separate things. Leaders don't come and followers come. They come because leaders express the fact that they're going to build a kind of alliance. You don't buy things unless there's an alliance of the thing you want to buy with the company. These positions are both competitive with each other too. Leaderships and followers are always part of this third element, this ongoing conditional accommodation between them, and not part of a durably established relationship. There are no durable relationships in this view. There's no class conflict. It's one of many conflicts, but class conflict can be moderated by leaderships changing the rules of the game and giving more material things or changing it to be more democratic. There's no stable conflicts, there's no stable accommodations, there's no stable cooperations. It's all these accommodations, which are both. This continues from exactly the same point. I already talked about that. But the point is also, as scale expands, you can see larger states, like the Soviet Union, not caring a lot about their citizens and having a lot of power over them. Smaller states, it's very hard for those governments to have a lot of control over their people. The same with big companies. Big companies may have a lot of control over what they want to sell, and if consumers don't like it, they get pushed on them. Think about GMO foods. Most people don't want to eat them, yet major corporations want to sell them. So it's a very, that alliance is very inequitable. But also, smaller scale, it can be more representative, like Adam Smith said. We got supply equals demand, leadership and followers cooperate with each other. But you can have huge inequalities, I think, as scale expands. And leaders get bigger, the pressure on followers will be much harder. Anyway, but here we're getting into the very interesting point where I critique dialectics and Karl Marx, per se. This is an open space and open future. So most of all these people we talked about so far, they're projecting this idea they can think they know where the future is going to be. No, I don't think anybody can ever predict the future, period. What we can do is look in the past of how people thought and interacted. So if we think about the present as open to many things, open choices matter in an ongoing, unpredictable history. And that is how the past was too. The past isn't leading to you. A lot of people will write history like, oh, and then this event happened, and this predicted that these other things will happen. No, a lot of things happen before that. That's kind of a narrative. That's called hindsight. Hindsight is never real. Hindsight means you think things are leading towards something and has to happen. I'll put a site for a really funny book that shows you how unpredictable history could be, just on, particularly on stories that you thought were so predictable that had to happen. But the most bizarre things happened in the French Revolution that really led to the French Revolution, not just predictive class conflicts. It's a bizarre idea that all these interactions are happening that are unpredictable in history, that are very important too. So if there's no dialectical destiny, then we can't have Elias's view of better improvement all the time, and we can't have Marx's view of conflict and destruction all the time. What we do have is people deciding on how to build alliances with each other, some representative, some unrepresentative. So we live in this open strategic and tactical interaction in space and over time. And compared to retrospect, there's patterns in space, and that's how we can hang our analysis. If there's no predictions about time, right? I'm saying you can't have some predictions about space. If you're going to have a strong jurisdiction or a strong company, it's going to push out and have an alliance with a lot of people, and that means in space, there's going to be other smaller markets and rural areas that may be fighting this. So you can analyze the spatial interactions of these different jurisdictions fighting and cooperating with each other. And this is both materially and ideationally, not just material conflicts. And that little image right there is something I'll show you in a minute. It doesn't have to be a royal house, it doesn't have to be an aristocratic house or peasants, but those kind of frameworks I look at in all of history. It's a spatial regularity. If the state is very strong, it will have an alliance with most of the peasants. It will not have an alliance with the aristocracy. If the state is very weak, the aristocracy will have a strong alliance with its regional population. Why? Because they don't want the king to have an alliance with everybody. So everybody is building their own attempts and accommodations to get their own power. Aristocracies don't typically have power unless they have a strong alliance and clientelism with their regional population. If the peasants that are really mad at the aristocracy, and they may support the king instead. You know, if everybody's really mad at the chaebol, they may suddenly support really small-scale industries. Or they may demand the state ally with them and not the chaebol. So I think of history as a trialectics, an unpredictable interaction in time, but with a more predictable interaction in space. So, in comparative retrospect, these strategic and spatial patterns due to patternings of more predictable spatial interactions and still unpredictable events in time. And based on these comparisons, we can assemble historical generalities in time, based on how people acted and what were the outcomes of that in the past. So in the past, we might have more historical generalities, but in the future, I don't think it's possible. And now it's in green, because it gets into the environmental issues that this I would also call a green theory of history, about time, because it's about this interaction between trends of degradation, relationships that are unrepresentative and degradative, versus relationships that are more sustainable and representative. And you can see that pattern in history very clearly, I think. We'll skip these points. But one last point I'll talk about in this section, then show you one diagram, and then we're finished. And if you're curious, you may look at the whole PowerPoint online. So all topics that I've suggested to you, none of them are exclusively about social things. None of them are exclusively about material things. Everything I've tried to invent in words, I went through a very rigorous pattern. I tried to make sure they're all dealing with social, biological, and physical things. You know, if an economist told me there's abstract commodities, I said, well, I don't see any abstract commodities. I see particular commodities in this particular arrangement versus other ones. So I see particular cultures using this commodity versus other ones. So, every topic that I'm talking about has this interscientific feeling to it. It's social, biological, and physical. And I think if we start with those ideas deductively, like Descartes, if we start with that idea, then we remove a lot of artificial things that aren't real. We assure ourselves that we develop topics that are interscientific and deal with the complexity of our world better. And that's the diagram. It's very similar to the other diagram. If things that are social, biological, and physical, I mean, there's departments in this university, or most universities, that totally separate these topics, right? They only want to talk about social things in the sociology department. They only want to talk about biology in the biology department. They'll talk about physics and material science, but how many physicists know the biological problems that certain chemicals have? How many sociologists or political scientists are interested that states may degrade their environment or not? How many physicists or how many biologists are aware of how material pollution affects the cell? One good example would be, think of a change in law. A change in law around agriculture is my favorite example that I tend to use. You may think that's a change in social things, but it's also going, if you change the social law, you're going to change maybe what farmers do biologically to the soil. So a social change really always does have these interscientific effects, but we don't talk about it that way. Also, it may change the physics of the soil itself. Also, maybe the weather patterns change. Maybe physics and the weather patterns change. That may change the biology of what farmers grow. That may change the politics of what is supported. So changes can happen from all three areas, I suggest, but they always will have this shadow. If you think about this biological thing happening in your mind, think about what's happening socially because of that. What's happening physically because of that. If something physically happens to change, think in your mind, what's biologically changing with that? What's sociologically changing with that? And that means in the middle, we have these real-world hybrids. And all of the topics I've talked about, I think, are hybrids so far, which is sort of the background of what I will talk about. All topics being ideationally merged material issues, social, biological, and physical, of all causality and all phenomenon. And by the way, the Stony Brook curriculum is very big on this interscientific interaction. If you look up Stony Brook curriculum, there's a nice website explaining why a lot of your classes have to deal with social things in general, or not just specializing in technology, but they want you a well-rounded person who can deal with the real world as it exists. The real world doesn't exist in university. Unfortunately, it does not. I wish it did, but the real world is this interaction of all these things, and that's what this school tries to prepare you for. Let me move on. I will skip the epistemology section, and I just want to show a few sections regarding my view of trialectics, which probably is the most charismatic idea. Trialectics, if you have all these different accommodations of people coming together, we've already talked about positions. Positions of leadership and followers come together. Why? They come together because somebody made an agreement, and it's a very tenuous, delicate agreement. That alliance creates the positions. The positions don't create the alliance. The alliance itself creates leadership. And the historical process, people in these positions employ alliances, find themselves within an ongoing series of changes. It's best to do this with a comparison of Marx and myself. Marx and Marx. Because Marx had a philosophy of history that most basically understand. Conflict, explosions. Eventually, there's going to be a totally different world. Material things are important. Conflict is important. Also because Marx had this conflict base of stratification, but he was very functional. He thought this is always going to be the case, that there's no cooperation ever. So Marx is very easy to make my straw man. Straw man is an artificially simplified enemy. Marx did change over time, as we learned, the early Marx, the later Marx. But anyway, because Marx had a philosophy of the origins of all power in economic reductionism, that's also something I'm going to critique as well. And here's just some images that I'll talk to. Let's simplify Marx. 2 lines. There's a class conflict. The upper classes and the lower classes. The upper classes have everything, and the lower classes have nothing. That's the great simplification, right? And Mark, or me, Mark Whitaker, the upper class is not a class. The upper class tends to be very divided. The royal house doesn't always agree with what this aristocracy in the rural provinces want. The state government of Korea doesn't always agree with what major chaebol or banks or religious institutions want to do. So they're both large, but some are larger than the others. And the state really is premised on the idea that it's the largest alliance. The state, if the corporation was really the larger alliance, the state would, the corporation would be the state in this view. But so upper classes are not unified, and also lower classes are not unified. Think of Korean regional politics. Is there a common agreement against the upper class? Probably not. There's different distrusts and hatreds because of space. This is the famous interaction between Jeollado and Gyeongsang provinces that most still don't marry. Political backgrounds, whoever you hate, I like the other guy. It's always going to be the opposite. And that's a long-term pattern that's always existed. But many regions in different societies have very different views, and some will really like to support a regional group. Like they'll want more regional power, but other regions may say, no, we don't like regional power, we want to support the centralized state. So you end up with that trialectical dynamic. So that's another way of writing this dilemma. And just like Halloween, it looks like a Halloween jack-o'-lantern, so doesn't it? And that's the different view of it. You have, in this case, if the royal or the central state is stronger, it has an alliance with multiple smaller groups. And at the same time, this is like a vacuum. This means there is less power and less alliance potential for larger chaebol, for larger corporations, for rural aristocracies. But think about a change in which alliance is stronger. In this case, the state and the larger groups make an agreement among themselves, and the people, it's not very important. A really good example of this is Korean ActiveX. I mean, everybody, right? You didn't really choose ActiveX. If you ever want to use something in Korea and you're a Korean citizen, you have to go through something that was organized a long time ago, not with a lot of public support. You have to put your information within a financial industry using these old ActiveX frameworks. That is an example of this infrastructure between groups. Tax policies that benefit the wealthy versus distribution to the poor. I mean, all these things can be thought about as a different kind of alliance. Other kinds of alliances, very regional alliances that are stronger. Think about the Three Kingdoms period in Korea, where regional states were more important than previous larger states. That's what this is. Regional groups allied with their peasants, and the centralized ideas, centralized support has failed. This doesn't mean it's militarily failed. It means culturally it's failed. People don't trust it, it's too corrupt, so they look for something else, or they go only to regional things. So it helps understand the change of support over time, which is very much like what Tarde was talking about, right? All the different rise and fall of support or hatred for things. I'll move this, I don't want to talk about that right now. I don't want to talk about that either. Excuse me. Explaining images in the text, in text. Instead of unified upper classes with clear dialectical opposition to lower classes, divided and split elites are very normal in history. It's very weird if they cooperate totally against everybody else. Why? Because regional groups in space want to operate better and have more jurisdiction for themselves against a distant power. Most times, all these theorists of the past we talked about, they have no view of space. So this is really the first view of space that you're seeing. And space becomes very important because the extensions, people extend their alliances with people, they're going to meet another group trying to do the same thing. And so that leads to these cooperative as well as conflictual trialectic interactions. Divided and split elites are normal. Examples, aristocratic institutional forms of property, culture, hegemony that frustrate a king being a central state. Royal-based, centralized public jurisdiction of property, culture, hegemony frustrates private groups. But also, local autonomy, if you just had a circle only, that frustrates both alliances with aristocracies and kings. So that's why typically aristocracies don't like autonomous peasant communes. They don't want the peasantry to have their own religion different than them because that allows them to build an alliance for themselves, amongst themselves. Anyway, So pay attention, with this particular ontology, what does it see? It sees jurisdictional conflicts and the way people strategically act in history to appeal to people. Like if I see another group getting a lot of power, I might try to say the same things and try to get those people over here. I say, I'm sorry, I promise I'll be more representative. Just come back to me in my alliance. Don't follow these people. That things happen all the time. And you as citizens, for instance, if there's two professors here and we're competing, you're in the position of power because you can choose. Like I want a better deal from you both. And you can keep changing. Like, thank you for the deal. I'll take the money. But thank you. I'll join you if you give me some more money or you give me a little extra power or give me more autonomy. So if elites cooperate, lower classes get the worst deal. But if elites are fighting, lower classes tend to get a better deal. So the dynamics really helps us understand about the representative or unrepresentative quality of these things. Jurisdiction is interscientific. It affects our stratification, our ideology, what materials we use, everything. Moving on, instead of unified lower classes with clear dialectical opposition to upper classes, divided lower classes are normal. Split lower classes are normal. Split in three ways. They can be split in their elite support. May have a really popular regional aristocracy or corporation or consumer pattern that other corporations can't touch. Scotland has a lot of particular commodities that Scottish people really love and that no international companies can enter that market because they don't want them. They really are satisfied. Irn-Bru is a local soft drink that really only exists in Scotland because it fits their taste, and so local groups make Irn-Bru, and Coca-Cola and Pepsi are very marginal in that. So you can think about not only politics, but materials, cooperation as well. Anyway, they're split in their elite support, split in their rejection of elites entirely. Sometimes local groups reject all forms of elites. Others keep adhering. So some will keep elite support, but some will not, and they hate each other for that. Like, why are you still supporting this king when you could be an autonomous group like us? So elites hate each other for their decisions they make, and regional groups hate each other for the decisions they make. And also, as I said, different regional parts of a country typically are split against themselves. I'm not saying this is good. I'm just saying it's sort of what Durkheim would call a sociological fact. It's just something you end up, admitting. You don't really want to admit it, but it's something that should be observed for the effect it has. So, split against themselves within the so-called lower class. They are all divided into particular frameworks of regional optimization, regional improvement. Each region has its own optimal forms of culture, elites, ideologies, material choices, languages, accents, clothing, ways of treating gender, ethnic attitudes, many things like that. One more thing. So in summarizing just those 2 points, empirical reality, I would argue, ontology, is upper class split elites. Empirical reality is lower class, or split localized elites. They're split because the major vector of power is spatial scale of all three different interests. The regional groups are not regional, they're smaller in scale, and the other groups are slightly larger. Let me show one image relating to that, and then I'll close off on that. Here we go. One good example. This is translated to looking down on it from space. The larger circle on the right represents, say, a larger king that's made a successful alliance with all the small groups around it. And therefore, all these were previous regionally strong aristocracies. Or you might think of these as regional governments within a centralized government framework. And there's still some on the outside, because there's no borders in the world, real borders socially. So in this situation, this is what this diagram represents. You have this strong royal alliance with everybody. And it's conditional, right? If something the king does or this government does that everybody doesn't like, they may change their support immediately. Changing that to a royal and more aristocratic alliance, notice these groups are now on top. So regional groups are powerful religious institutions, big banks, big corporations, are above the state. The state sort of follows them, is afraid of them. State's still there. State still has larger jurisdiction. But like if a crime is committed by a major corporation, I'm not going to jail. And things don't happen like that all the time. They have very strong powers to stop the administration of law. So they're really eating. They're eating at the larger jurisdiction this way. And the other framework, if you have this aristocratic strength with local groups, that'd be corporations and regions versus any states versus any central regulation. You have a lot of these groups totally submerging a larger state jurisdiction. A lot more regional autonomy from smaller groups as well, all around it. So that's another way that I picture history. I showed you Elias's graph of the figuration, like a snake. That's just a single thing. I mean, you need to keep in mind every one of those is kind of a figuration. They're all interacting and competing with each other in some ways. And then sometimes in New World history, everybody hates aristocrats and kings together, and they prefer to totally have a regional life. For 300 years after the Han Dynasty, there was no state, there was no support for aristocracy, there was no Confucianism. Nobody even believed it anymore. They didn't exchange the books, everybody became Buddhist, regional, and they were very hostile to the whole idea of reintroducing Confucianism. And Confucianism was reintroduced by the military sword in the 500s and 600s. And then later, like Elias said, people slowly gave up Buddhism and revolts and became good, internalized Confucian citizens again. Always under the threat of violence, too. So those four ideas, those four images on the right, are a good example of changes of jurisdiction in history. And that's sort of the way I see a lot of world history. Other approaches, or you can think about that. These alliances between people, I'll close on this, these alliances within people are not just material, but they're an agreement to have a certain kind of gender relationship. Like, in a Confucian structure, the law will always protect the male line over any female concerns. It may even remove all female inheritance. So the alliance would be with the state as a male with other males. A Korean change happened in the 1980s where females, the state, were now allowed to have a bank account. But Korean females are still classified under the male hierarchy in the census. So you can see how the alliance is really a male-structured alliance of jurisdiction over female bodies. The United States doesn't have that. The alliance of the United States is individuals. Individuals means male and female equal. So individuals are given individual rights regardless of gender. And those abbreviations are 17 different ways all jurisdictions work. Gender, there's a way they treat ethnicity, the way they treat sexuality, the way handicapped people are treated, the way people sick or healthy are treated, the way people respect or hate age, the way people treat religion in a particular alliance. Sometimes you could not even be a member of a government class unless you were already a member of a certain religion. So that's part of a physical alliance in some ways. Language, sometimes you had to learn the accent of the elite from a capital, whether in Seoul or in Beijing. If you spoke a rural version of Chinese, no, you had to change it to join this larger jurisdiction and to be an elite that way. So language itself is not just something we share, it's a particular alliance. You speak a certain way in England, like that. You're probably not going to get a lot of friends unless you go down the Cockney area. But, you probably don't understand what I'm talking about. But there's so many different micro accents in London. Go to YouTube and look up different accents for English. It's fascinating because each of those have a different class and sort of an ethnic feel to them almost. Anyway, ideology. If you believe in communism, you're probably not going to join a bureaucracy in Samsung. So there's an ideological filter for particular businesses and institutions. Materials, the particular materials we have in life and use are important. Class is important too, but it's just one of many factors. Violence is important. Most sociologists, we have not even discussed violence. Violence is a very important thing that is almost edited out from a lot of things we talked about. So how do you solve violence or use violence? And if you have this view of an alliance, violence is an alliance. In the United States, Here's a really good example of how violence is an alliance. Max Weber had a famous theory that violence was the monopoly of the state. Well, then explain this example. In the United States, recently, the public jury acquitted a group of armed terrorists, basically, but they were white. These white groups were upset with the regime of land in their region. And so they took over a federal zone and they held it against the federal police for several months. And then they were finally arrested. They go to court, right? Guess what? They're free. When you're white in the United States, it's okay to have a gun. When you're an ethnic minority in the United States, it's typically not. Contrast this with what's happening in North Dakota. There is a Canadian pipeline trying to come down. It's going through a Native American population. Native American population has no arms. They're conducting prayer rituals, and they get shot. An 11-year-old was shot recently. You're not aligning. So violence will stratify and keep a particular group over another group. That's very important. Territory, territory, who gets to go where is very important to stratification, to honor. But we're also stratified by which group controls us, whether it be a central state, a regional government, or a local group. All those things matter as well. We're stratified by alliance too. Whichever alliance is stronger. In the United States, the federal government's very strong, but regional states are equally strong. In some states like Spain, Spain has a very weak central government and its regions are stronger. So this changes over time. You can really explain a lot of the variation of history with this trialectical perspective like that. And that's how I picture it. You think of, if this group makes an alliance with somebody, they don't make an alliance in abstract. They have to have a particular attitude towards territory, the way they use violence, the way they distribute materials, what kind of gender relationship they're going to try to appeal to, what kind of ethnicity they're going to talk about. So those are the stuff of which history is made, those 17 factors that I looked at right there. And that's all I really have time for today. And I know it's a mouthful, but I put a PowerPoint if you're curious, and I'm always welcome to have someone contact me or talk about it. But that's another way I would problem solve. And it really helps me problem solve about durable democracies and sustainability. This is what we're going to talk about next. Thank you, and have a good afternoon. I saw the red stamp.
왜? 안 되려고?
Oh yeah, it's a lot to put in there, but it's very different. It's very different. I'll say that much. Yeah.